Hello and bonjour, I'm Sarah Bukhari and you're watching Power Dilemma here at TAG TV. In a Maclean's Canada project survey in partnership with Abacus Data, it was found that for almost every poll question, immigrant Canadians seem to be the most resistant to acknowledging racialized and cultural issues and held the most assimilationist attitudes on the matter of whether Canada should continue to accept Syrian refugees. 30% of immigrant Canadians strongly disagreed, higher than first-generation Canadians by a margin of 9 points and higher than Canadians whose families had been here for multiple generations by 11 points. On whether Islamophobia is a problem in Canada, 22% of immigrant Canadians strongly disagreed, compared to 15% of first-gens and 11% of multi-gens. Does this mean there is a problem with tolerance in our immigrant community? Do you believe so? In looking at the numbers for nearly every question centered on minority groups, immigrant Canadians hold the strongest contrarian views, followed by first-generation Canadians, then multi-generational Canadians. The elders among the migrant peer group, often hailing from Commonwealth or formerly colonized countries, are keenly aware of assimilationist pressure and often internalize it for survival's sake. It was common among first-wave Caribbeans, for example, to discourage their children from using Patio's dialect in school and growing their hair beyond a certain length, even while the natural hair movement took hold among black communities in the 1970s. Often these perspectives come from fear of being ostracized by the dominant communities and a desire for their children to have the best opportunities possible. Those attitudes can result in views that reflect lessons hammered into their psyche over years and even decades of trying to blend in. Children of immigrants, on the other hand, who grew up as a boxed-in peer group among white students and later white co-workers, internalize a different lesson: safety in numbers. There is a certain comfort in switching out of the code of Eurocentric social standards, which require both effort and a high degree of tolerance for day-to-day aggressive interactions. So there is a certain comfort in switching out of the code of Eurocentric social standards, which require both effort and a high degree of tolerance for day-to-day microaggressive interactions. Think being asked, "Where are you really from?" when meeting a new white coworker, or having a stranger's curious, grasping fingers plunge into your hair while riding public transit. Among those first-generation Canadians who may have been born elsewhere but grew up here, the pressure to fit in takes a backseat to asserting one's personal cultural autonomy for the second generation and afterwards. Don't bother trying. We are probably marching in the streets against assimilationist attitudes and policies. So, folks, today we are going to follow and debate the question of Canadian identity, assimilation in Canada, and what is multiculturalism. So, to talk about this, we have our very worthy guest online on the phone. Our first guest is our very regular speaker, Mr. Ali Naqvi, who is an immigration counsel. Welcome to my show, Mr. Naqvi.
Thank you for inviting me, Sarah.
And my other worthy guest is Mr. Brett McDermott, who has been on TAG TV several times, and he is a political analyst. Welcome to my show, Mr. McDermott.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
Okay, so my first question is to you, Mr. Naqvi, and if you can define what is the meaning of assimilation in Canada.
Thank you, Sarah, for raising these very important issues and questions in today's Canada. Because we are talking about diversity, culture, immigration, we should start by acknowledging that this land we call Canada, we love as our home country, actually belongs to the First Nations. We are in Mississaugas that legitimate owners of Mississauga and Canada are First Nations of Mississauga and Mississauga. So I always start by acknowledging that the First Nations are hosting us in this country, and we are obliged and very grateful to them. To answer your question, when immigrants come to Canada, like when I came to Canada, assimilation means how to cross the road, because most of us, as you mentioned, come from countries where the traffic laws are very different. Assimilation starts with going back to school. Assimilation starts with making new friends, learning about how people in Canada who have been here before us live, and how they treat each other. Most of us, people coming from overseas, do not come from, unfortunately, some of them do, but most of them don't, unfortunately, come from sharing communal societies. For us, assimilation actually means to learn the fact that paying higher taxes actually results in getting my neighbor treated at the hospital where I'll be treated. Assimilation means that, one fine day, if I have to go to the hospital, the federal minister of health may be sitting next to me and waiting in queue like I am. That there is equality in this country.
Which doesn't happen a lot in a lot of other countries, because if you talk about South Asian countries particularly, a minister wouldn't sit with you in a queue to wait for his or her turn.
So Canada teaches us a lot, and on our part, as an immigrant to Canada, and as an advocate of immigration and for refugees, I believe that the onus is upon us to take these teachings and learn them, and then follow the Canadian way of life. And the Canadian way of life it does not ask us to dissolve ourselves in the melting pot. We can have our religious freedom, and we can have our cultural freedoms, as long as they do not interfere with anybody else's freedoms. And this is, I believe, a point that we fail on in a lot of cases. So assimilation does not mean that I give up myself, my culture, and my religion, but assimilation actually requires me to respect others' freedoms more than mine.
Yes, so Mr. Naqvi is right that assimilation means how to cross a road, maybe going back to school and learning new things. But where to draw a line? And at this point, I'd like to ask Mr. Brett McDermott how he defines assimilation in Canada.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for the opportunity to speak today. I think that this question of assimilation versus celebrating one's differences in some ways is a bit of a false dichotomy, because you could argue that multiculturalism is a form of assimilation, in that we encourage people to keep their differences, and that is an expression of assimilation. Now, that being said, I think you could also argue that when a lot of newcomers come to Canada, the reality is that it would be very difficult, I think, to function, in the labor market and business without knowing at least some English or French. Whether that's a requirement set in place for immigrants when they're immigrating to Canada, or whether it's a decision that they make when they arrive to improve their English if they don't speak English, or improve their French if they don't speak English or French prior to arrival. That's a decision they can make. I think that multiculturalism can exist without moral relativism. And what I I mean by that is there's a common thread of thought in Canada today and elsewhere too, where where people feel that we cannot make a moral pronouncement on any type of practice, any type of cultural tradition, and any type of moral outlook. And I just profoundly disagree with that. We can have multiculturalism without moral relativism. We can have a multiculturalism where we can say certain practices like honor killings, certain traditional practices like honor killings, or female genital mutilation, for instance, female circumcision, are morally wrong for obvious reasons. I don't think there should be any requirement or obligation on the part of Canadians to show any, responsible neutrality, to use Justin Trudeau's words from a number of years ago. Of course, Mr. Trudeau said before he was Prime Minister that he called that we should use, quote, responsible neutrality on honor killings. He did backtrack a bit on that subsequent to that statement, but it certainly reflects a lack of desire or an unwillingness to make moral pronouncements on cultural traditions that I think we can quite rationally find abhorrent. So I think multiculturalism can exist in a society without moral relativism, and I look forward to that debate continuing in the next little while. But I'm quite willing to defend that position, here on TAG TV or anywhere else in Canada.
So, Mr. Naqvi, you said that assimilation means learning new things about Canada. For example, crossing a road, going back to school, even how to do groceries. But continue connecting to your cultural precepts or cultural norms. How would you define that people who say that honor killings is a cultural precept, FGM's female genital mutilation belongs to a certain culture? How would you justify these cultural norms and assimilation in Canada?
I don't believe anybody but Mr. Trudeau justify these. And Mr. Trudeau can justify anything in order to get votes and funding. So I don't know an immigrant to Canada, a new Canadian, who would stand up and actually defend these abhorrent acts that happen overseas. The FGM or the honor killing has nothing to do with any religion. This is a tribal practice, both of them. And these are denounced by new Canadians, may they be from Africa to South Asia to anywhere, on a daily basis. We new Canadians do not condone these practices. We are absolutely against these practices. And anybody who tries to justify or give them neutralization terminology, we certainly oppose that, and we actually should vote these people out who use these abhorrent practices to garner a section of the votes. So there are people, the radicalized, the extremists who are in our beloved country, and we have a government who's willing to import back the ISIS fighters and on our dime rehabilitate them without charging them with any any criminal offense. So where does the buck start? The buck starts at if I'm breaking the law in Canada, and if the authorities do not prosecute me for breaking the law, even after finding it out that I've broken the law. So my bigger concern would be that the reason we're talking about these issues is because now this has come to the surface where there are politicians who are raising these issues. I would like to point out that both the corporate parties May they be the conservatives or, the former conservative MP or the current Trudeau Liberal government. They're both using these identity issues to garner sections of the votes. They
Mr.
do not
Naqvi,
believe in the solution.
Mr. Naqvi, you've pointed out at identity issues. What is Canadian identity? Let's talk about Canadian identity, and then we will continue on various identities of various immigrant communities. So what is Canadian identity?
The Canadian identity is somebody who is authorized to claim that he or she is Canadian, believes in Canadian law and do his or her utmost practices and follow Canadian law. Is a believer and somebody who practices equality and believes in democracy. These are the basic foundations laid down in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for us, and this is what I think Canadian identity is.
Would you? What do you have to say, Mr. Brett McDermott?
Well, I think the Canadian identity has evolved and changed over the years. I think if you look at things historically from when the American Revolution took place, there was clearly a different type of identity, different identity in the colonies that would become Canada than in the United States. The colonies that would become the United States and the colonies that would become Canada were all British colonies at one point prior to 1776, and then of course the American Revolution took place and there was a divergence in identities, and you had the flow of United Empire loyalists from the United States of America to the colonies that would become Canada, and that helped shape this country's identity that was based heavily in its first number of decades post-American Revolution, in line with in line with loyalty to Britain and the British Crown. Of course, the Canadian identity has evolved and changed over the years. We've seen how Canadians have seen their identity more associated with social programs like universal health care. A lot of Canadians see their identity that way. And then I think actually the Canadian identity has evolved and changed again, or more so in the latter part of the 20th century or an early 21st century, where we've seen embrace of multiculturalism. Although I would always say that multiculturalism does not imply moral relativism. You can have multiculturalism while still having a debate about what is moral and what is not moral. There are people who I think in Canada and elsewhere who feel that we should not be making moral pronouncements on some practices morally, and I think that reflects an extreme, or I shouldn't say extreme, but it reflects a type of multiculturalism that I can't support. That's not to say that I'm against multiculturalism. I'm in favor of multiculturalism, but one that includes some form of moral boundaries.
So, okay, yeah, Brett, you've explained what is Canadian identity, what is the meaning of being Canadian. But the question is, when new immigrants come to Canada, what should they do, or what should they throw off from their original cultures to be called real Canadians? Yes, they have citizenship, they are Canadian citizens, but what practices should they follow to be connected to Canadian identity?
You know what, I think one of the realities about Canada is that there are differing levels of identification amongst Canadians to being Canadian. And what I mean by that is polling has shown that across the country, a lot of people who are longtime citizens of Canada will identify first with their province and second with their country. This is true in Atlantic provinces, in the West, in Quebec. The province where people overwhelmingly identify with the country first as part of their identity, and the province second is Ontario. But many other provinces, people other 9 provinces or so, people overwhelmingly identify with their province, oftentimes than their country. So to use that type of logic then with newcomers, I don't see a big problem if people have a dual identity based upon where they came from and being in Canada. I don't think there's a problem with hyphenated Canadianism. I don't think there's a problem if people, celebrate, the soccer team of their homeland outside of Canada, because, that's something that's part of their identity. I don't see any issue with that. I live in a neighborhood in Toronto where there's a lot of people who are strong supporters of countries other than Canada in the World Cup, and I'm fine with that. That's fine. I don't see an issue with that. As long as we've got a common commitment to respect one another and treat each other equally, I think that we've got a foundation for a country here, and it's a unique country at that.
So, Mr. Naqvi, what do you have to say, if you want to add into what Brett said, that new immigrants, when they come to Canada, they do get Canadian citizenship. What do they have to give off to become real Canadians or connect with or blend in with Canadian identity?
The test is very simple. The threshold is actually very low. And it's simply that my freedoms should not interfere or burden or create hardship for anybody else's freedom. That we need to realize, it's a two-way street. Canada accommodates us with open arms. We are invited to apply for immigration, immigrate to Canada if we qualify. If we are, once we are here, we have equal opportunities. May it be religion or culture, we can practice it. However, unless and until my religious practices or my moral practices or my cultural practices do not interfere in my neighbor's practice, life. Unless and until something that I do does not make anybody else uncomfortable or unhappy. We need to teach ourselves, being new Canadians, that we live in a country where we share things, that we all are equal. And, it takes generations for us to realize that, because our past generations, maybe even our DNA is structured in a way where equality, realizing equality and realizing a sharing society does not really is digestible for us for a very long time. But the second generation Canadians, my children who are born here, they do not have those moral, cultural, religious hiccups that I or my parents may have. So, in my opinion, unless and until I don't interfere with somebody else's freedom, I don't hurt anybody's feelings with my religion, my culture, my practices, I could be an equal Canadian.
Why is there so much hue and cry about the issue of multiculturalism in Canada recently? If someone is practicing, if people are practicing, if Canadians are practicing good values and norms from their original countries, and they're not interfering with the freedom of their neighbor, then why multiculturalism has become a huge issue of controversy in Canadian politics?
So, it is only a controversy in Canadian politics. As I said earlier, both these corporate large parties are using the identity, the immigration, the diversity issues to their advantage. And there are segments of society that are extreme on both ends, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, pro-diversity, anti-diversity, and people are trying to claim their corners, claim their territories in terms of those votes for the 2019 elections. Somebody who has, as a government, failed to provide clean drinking water to First Nations has a big issue on diversity. Whoever it is, if somebody questions the Prime Minister of Canada about who's going to pay Quebec back for the asylum seekers, should not be declared a racist. Whoever is the citizen of Canada, irrespective of what group he or she comes from, has the right to ask the Prime Minister, who has made himself available to answer questions in a public gathering, about who's going to pay his or her province for the extraordinary work they are doing, humanitarian work they are doing for the asylum seekers. These questions can be asked by members of parliament in the House of Commons, but it cannot be asked by somebody on the street. Yes, he or she may be racist. I don't care. But as a Canadian citizen, he or she had the right to ask that questions. So declaring anybody racist, whoever asks a question, is not Canadian. And I'm very clear about that, irrespective of who or she, who it may have been who asked the question. So he's playing with the future of my children here. Mr. Prime Minister, you are playing with the future of our children here by sowing these seeds. You cannot just call people racist because they raise a question about diversity. You could have convinced somebody that accepting on humanitarian grounds asylum seekers in Canada is a mutual responsibility of all Canadians, which is our policy under the domestic and international law. But no, the Prime Minister inflamed the debate by using the word racist. And of course, there is, equal and opposite reaction to every action. So of course, now we have people trying to, use this to their advantage on the other extreme.
Brett, what do you have to say to the connection of multiculturalism connected to the question of racism in the backdrop of what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently was caught at camera saying?
Well, I think people we're living in a time where people are trying to find racism under the carpet, in the broom closet, on people's hard drives, on people's smartphones, and it's almost kind of it's out of control, frankly. And it's not to say that racism doesn't exist, but people are accusing each other of racism right, left, and center at the drop of a hat. And I think there needs to be a far more respectful dialogue in Canada on matters of race. Moreover, I mean, if you accuse people of racism over and over and over again, you may be cheapening what racism actually is. You may actually be diminishing what it actually is. And so I think people need to show a lot more restraint in public discourse on these matters. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist. It does, but we need to be more careful on what we're suggesting is racist and what is not.
So how far multiculturalism is good or is workable to be a Canadian? This is a very tricky question, but a very sensitive question, because in Canada we have lots and lots of multiple diversities, various ethnicities, people of all, spectrum of religions and cultures. Where should we draw the line?
Sorry, I'm not quite clear on what you mean by where should we draw the line? Draw the line in what way? Sorry.
Yeah. So Brett, you gave the idea of relativism, moral relativism, that people should be practicing their norms, and they should be following their culture as far as it is not immoral. So, but when we talk about multiculturalism, and how far is it true, and how far is it genuine to be called a Canadian?
Well, I think that if somebody says that that we can't make moral pronouncements on some cultural traditions, and if we do, we're leaving ourselves open to being accused of intolerance and racism. Then I think that is where the line has been crossed. Frankly, I mean, we've seen in a lot of public debates where people like the Prime Minister have said that we need to ensure that people are included in public discourse. We need to have an inclusive society, and he's quite clear that when he criticizes people for not being willing to tolerate dissent on matters of inclusion. I don't think that there's any problem in saying to people that there are some practices that we find morally wrong, and I think that does not mean that I'm being xenophobic or intolerant or racism. I think that there are some items, some practices that people have engaged in globally and in Canada that we rightfully will find as morally wrong. That does not mean we lose out and cease being Canadian and we don't have multiculturalism then. So I think there are people on both the right and the left politically who kind of miss the point. They either do not think, or they're perhaps too insecure to make a moral pronouncement on some people's cultural traditions and practices, and then there are some people on the right who will say this is unacceptable what people are doing, and it's unacceptable that we have all this diversity and no common thread, common theme that binds us together. I actually think the commonality of being Canadian is multiculturalism. I think multiculturalism is part of who we are, and we can have varying levels of commitment to Canada as an identity, as a country, and still be part of the Canadian family. I think that's quite clear, and people have expressed that many, many times in the past.
So when we follow multiculturalism, the question arises that do the practices of some culture come in stark contrast or in opposition to the Charter of Canadian Rights and Freedoms? If Mr. Ali Naqvi could allude on that.
Well, I think we've got... Sorry, were you asking me? Sorry.
Mr. Naqvi.
Sorry.
That's okay. Mr. McDermott, please go ahead. It's okay.
Yeah, anyone can take the question.
Oh,
Can you
okay.
repeat the question, please?
So
yeah,
the question...
I think...
Go ahead, Mr.
Sorry, go ahead.
McDermott.
Do you want to repeat the question?
So my question is, if you're talking about multiculturalism, and the question arises that do the practices of some cultures within the multicultural mosaic of Canada, do they come in contrast to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or in clash with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Well, I'm sure there are. Mr. McDermott gave two examples, one of FGM and the other of honor killing. Of course, the Charter does not protect these tribal, ancient, abhorrent customs still in practice in some countries of the world. However, what I am the proponent of is once I'm a resident of Canada, working towards becoming a citizen. Since the day I land, the protection of Charter applies on me. Yes, but the obligations of the Canadian law also apply on me. As I said earlier, becoming Canadian takes a certain amount of time learning and processing the knowledge that I get. It may take a generation for that matter. However, I should not practice any of those rituals that I may have done overseas that are against or contrary to the Charter of Rights and the Canadian law. So, I may believe in certain things. I may continue to believe in certain things until I realize that those things are wrong. It may not happen in a minute or a year, but it should happen eventually. But if I practice that in Canada, I should be found liable. It's just like, God forbid, if somebody murdered somebody and, they were not found and immigrated to Canada, the law will eventually catch on and they may face deportation because of their past criminal act. So, people may have certain misguided beliefs before they come to Canada, but putting those beliefs in practice should never be condoned.
Okay, Mr. McDermott, please.
Yeah, I think that if we never had the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we'd still have multiculturalism in Canada. Multiculturalism was becoming a bigger and bigger part of what it means to be Canadian long before the Charter came along. The Charter certainly speaks to equality of everyone before the law, and nearly everyone in Canada, I think, would agree with that. The examples I gave about abhorrent moral practices that have gone on elsewhere in the world, they're clearly examples that are quite egregious and reprehensible. There are more subtle examples, though, in Canada where I think you could argue that some people may bring some traditions from other parts of the world that we find contrary to the Canadian values of equality and respect for differences. Many people around the world culturally tend to default to the notion that women should stay at home and raise children and clean and cook and so on in the home. And in my view, I don't think that we should be gender profiling women in such a way where we would expect them to do that and not expect husbands to do some of the cooking and cleaning in the home. So it's a more subtle example, a less blatant example of a cultural practice that I think we can express disagreement with and say it goes against the Canadian values of equality before the law. Everyone is equal before the law, but we would have that, I think, whether we had the Charter or not. I think ultimately the Charter is a political document. I know, it's obviously a legal document, a constitutional document, but it is also a political document. It was brought in, I think, partially by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the provincial leaders at the time in the early 80s to create something to which all Canadians could look to and say, that makes me proud to be Canadian. I think, unfortunately, in the 36 years or so since the Charter came into being, not all Canadians like some of the decisions that have come about as a result of the Charter. And I'm not saying that they're right or wrong to agree with those decisions. I'm saying that their disagreement with a lot of Charter-based rulings reflects how the Charter is not essential to Canada, and the Charter can be misconstrued as something that is essential to Canada. We had equality before the law, and we had equality amongst Canadians, and we had respect for cultural and cultural traditions, and multiculturalism long before we had the Charter. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for participating in my show. Thank you, Mr. Ali Naqvi, who is an Immigration Council. And thank you very much, Mr. Brett McDermott, who is a political analyst. Viewers, we were tackling with the question of Canadian assimilation, multiculturalism, and we also touched upon racism a little bit. So as our gentlemen analyzed, as our speakers analyzed, that assimilation for new immigrants means learning new things about Canada, crossing a road, learning the Canadian system, learning the Canadian culture. And the real test of multiculturalism is that you should do everything in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, anything which does not interfere with the freedom of your neighbor, but at the same time, you are obliged to follow Canadian law. With this thought, we will see you again. Ciao.